Yeah, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the CGS-CIMB 14th Annual Indonesian Conference. The first track for today, for virtual, the topic is balancing between economic development and green policy. Before we start, I would like to introduce each of the speakers today. We have Mr. Ralph Van Doorn, Senior Economist for World Bank. Mr. Ralph has been working as the economist on Philippines, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Maldives. He has also advised various governments on fiscal policy, debt management, and trade policy. Next, we have Mr. Wahyu Agung Nugroho, Field Director of Department of Economic and Policy of Bank Indonesia. Mr. Wahyu has been working with Bank Indonesia since 1998 in the area of economic research and monetary policy. He has also written several research papers on international capital flows. We also have Mr. Adi Budiarso, Head of Financial Sector Policy Center at Indonesian Fiscal Policy Agency, or BKF, at the Ministry of Finance. Mr. Adi has been working at various functions with the MOF for more than 30 years, including position as Head of Central Transformation Office at Ministry of Finance and also Head of Climate Change and Multilateral Financing at BKF. So, in the session today, we would like to explore two topics. First is on Indonesian economic prospects, given the extraordinary global situation, and second is on the green policy that have and can be explored by Indonesia as a country. With the current environmental issues the world is facing, we think growth is just not measured in terms of strength, but also by its sustainability. So to kickstart off, I would like to give the opportunity to Mr. Ralph to share on the economic prospects, like from the Mr. Ralph's point of view, how Mr. Ralph sees Indonesian position amidst the current global volatility. Traditionally, it has not been positive for Indonesia. How can it be different this time around? Are the risks and positive that we should look at? Thank you. Please, Mr. Ralph.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pak Ali, and selamat pagi, everyone. And thank you very much for joining. I will present from some recently finished work by the World Bank, and try to draw some conclusions for Indonesia. So what I'm presenting now and will be discussing is work that has been published this summer. The Global Economic Prospects, which you can find at worldbank.org/GEP, and the Indonesia Economic Prospects, where I've drawn some editions from December last year about the energy transition, and also June this year about the latest economic developments for Indonesia. So let's start with the view of the world. If you look on our most recent projections for the growth for the world economy have been downgraded. You can see in the chart on the left that in 2021 growth was 5.7%, and it's our projection for 2022 is only 2.9%. 2.9%, and after this dip, we don't expect any rebound, and it will just gradually go up to edge up to 3% in 2023. This is a marked difference from what we thought back in January, before all these shocks hit our countries, when growth was projected to be for 2022 was projected to be 4.1%. So maybe I can, apologies, maybe I can switch off sound on my side. So if you look on the chart on the right, while we have slowing growth, we also see inflation moving in the other direction. Price pressure started in 2021 from the supply side, and also with the recovery of global demand. And this has received a turbo boost with commodity price shocks in February. So we see that nearly all the countries that have inflation targeting, they currently have inflation above the official targets. And markets expect inflation to peak in 2022 and then decline, but it will remain elevated. Similarly, most commodity prices are expected to remain significantly higher in 2021 than in 2022 than in 2021, and to remain high in the medium term. So what does that mean for Indonesia and the region? I mean, first of all, the good news, Indonesia is doing relatively well compared to peer countries. If you look both at overall GDP, in the chart on the left, you can see that Indonesia's GDP is already above its pre-pandemic level, whereas other big countries in East Asia, you can look at Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, they're still around the pre-2019 level, which is the pre-pandemic level. So Indonesia's recovery is ahead of some of the peer countries. Also, if you look at dig a bit deeper into the kind of the sectoral composition, again, we see that many sectors in Indonesia have already recovered to their pre-pandemic levels, even contact-sensitive sectors, for example, transportation, communication, catering, which is basically tourism. You can see that other big countries in the region, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand, several sectors, especially contact-intensive sectors, are still below the 2019 levels. So this suggests that Indonesia is in a better place during this crisis than it was back in, say, the Asia financial crisis or the global financial crisis 2008 or the taper tantrum. It looks at Indonesia has more policy space now than it did in those days. It has higher reserves. Compared to the taper tantrum, its current account deficit is now actually a small surplus. It has built up a credible monetary and fiscal policy over the last 20 years, and those things matter. And that looks as if Indonesia, went into this pandemic, with fairly good fundamentals, and that's something worth noting. And that may be what is the main difference between Indonesia today compared to Indonesia during the previous crisis. Now, maybe we can zoom a bit deeper into how is Indonesia exposed actually to this, the direct impact of the war, but also the shocks. Well, first of all, Indonesia has a very limited direct impact through the FDI and trade channels, because there are very limited direct links to Russia and Ukraine. Trade with those countries is low, investment from those countries is low, and there are no external liabilities to those countries. However, Indonesia, as a big commodity exporter, is, of course, exposed to global commodity prices. And that's a double-edged sword for Indonesia. We see, for example, that there's an upward pressure on commodity prices in Indonesia through trade, and upward pressure on inflation. This leads to two different impacts on fiscal. For example, the subsidy bill has been going up, both the explicit on-budget energy subsidies and food subsidies too, but also the kind of off-budget subsidy that's provided through the oil and electricity state-owned enterprises that have fixed their prices below the market rates. At the same time, Indonesia also benefits from high commodity prices on the revenue side. There's fiscal tax and fiscal non-tax revenue from the commodity sectors. And over time, these actually are more or less moving in line, which is both good and bad news. The good news is that all these high commodity prices and the increased subsidy bill is going to be more or less offset by increased revenue from the commodity sectors. On the other hand, it's partially a wasted windfall, because half of the subsidy that Indonesia provides through fiscal and non-fiscal means goes to the wealthier parts of the population, and they could be better targeted. In that case, Indonesia would have a net windfall from this commodity price boom rather than a net zero windfall. It also leads to trade surpluses. As I said earlier, Indonesia is running a small current account surplus, And the high commodity prices also will increase incomes, especially for those working in the sectors related to the commodity sector, and that will also lead to more private consumption. So it's a mixed impact. There will also be, Indonesia also exposed to global financial markets, again, as many emerging markets. And there, Indonesia is in a fairly good place. The high commodity prices are leading to a lot of equity inflows, and the Jakarta Stock Exchange is booming. At the same time, local currency debt holdings have reduced a lot since the start of the pandemic, and those outflows are continuing in all countries, including Indonesia, and that's putting pressure on yields in the exchange rate. But again, Indonesia's exchange rate depreciation is not as much as other countries in the region. Finally, there's going to be impact on poverty. These high food and energy prices are going to affect the poor households of Indonesia, and that puts pressure on the government to keep in place those subsidies. Again, they can be better targeted to the poor, so that Indonesia has a net windfall. But that's a discussion we'll have later. Now, what does that mean for our outlook for Indonesia? On the left, you can see our outlook that we presented back in June. So you can see the GDP growth we expected to go to 5.1% in 2022 and increase further to 5.3% in the medium term. But we also expect inflation to be higher and close to the upper bound, maybe above the upper bound of BI, inflation target. We expect that Indonesia will remain on track in this fiscal consolidation. As I said earlier, the commodity boom is going to affect both sides, the revenue side and the expenditure side. But Indonesia's introduction of the tax harmonization law late last year, we do expect it will have a positive impact on the revenue side, which will facilitate the fiscal consolidation and the return to the 3% fiscal rule from 2023. We expect government debt to settle at around 44% of GDP, from about 30% of GDP before the pandemic. This is still well below the 60% of GDP legal threshold. And finally, we expect the current account to be in surplus this year. And as the economy recovers further and imports pick up, we expect the current account to go back to a deficit. Now, there are also risks, both global risks and it's a risk for Indonesia specifically. The global risks are that the increasing interest rates in many developed world central bank is going to lead to tighter global financial conditions and will lead to financial stress in many emerging markets. That's something that worries us as the World Bank across many countries. Now, in Indonesia specifically, we can also look at sustained price pressures may lead to more subsidies, subsidy expansion at the cost of pro-growth programs. We also are concerned that Indonesia will also be exposed to the pressure that will trigger capital outflows for the emerging markets. And therefore, we also maintain in the back of our mind a downside scenarios. If these risks that I just mentioned materialize, we have also a downside scenario for growth of 4.6% this year and 4.7% next year. Now, there are also opportunities, and this is important, I think, important message, and hopefully our colleagues at BI and the Minister of Finance will also have something to say for it. We do expect that with all these shocks that are coming from the global economy, that macroeconomic policy space is shrinking. Right, the tax harmonization law has been passed. It's now about implementing the regulations and increase revenue. The tightening global financial conditions means there's less scope for lowering interest rates. In fact, BI is keeping interest rates fixed and has started to tighten its reserve requirements. So it means that there's less scope for macroeconomic policies to drive growth. And it means that structural policies will have to take over. And this is an agenda in Indonesia that has been much slower. While Indonesia built up a very good reputation for fiscal monetary policy credibility, the structural reform agenda has always lagged. So we would recommend for Indonesia to start again on this structural reform agenda. We're just going to highlight 4 sets of policy measures that we'd like to see. Strengthening the enabling environment for the firm recovery, particularly MSMEs. At the moment, the recovery has been driven initially by the fiscal, by the balance sheet of, well, the balance sheet of both the central bank and MOF, but the recovery now has to be driven again by the private sector. So important to increase access to credit, encourage firms to formalize, support them to make a green transformation and a digital transformation. It's important to implement trade policies to boost competitiveness, growth, and job creation. And this could include the development of downstream industries, which is something that is high up the agenda of the government. It's important to deepen the financial system, enhancing both the supply and demand for resources, improve the allocation of financial resources, and ensure the stability of the financial system. And finally, it's important to implement the structural reforms together with the tax reforms to make sure that you have the space for high quality spending. And subsidy reforms, energy subsidy reforms particularly, would be a good start. So I'll leave my presentation here and return to Pak Hali, and then we can, I'm open for questions on this part. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ralph. I'll come back to you later on your regarding your view on the green policy initiative. But before that, I would like to give the opportunity for Pak Wahyu first to share from Bank Indonesia point of view on the monetary policy regarding how to balance between growth and stability on the economy in the next 12 to 18 months, given the extraordinary situation. Pak Wahyu, please, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Pak Adi. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, Mr. Ralph, Pak Adi, and all participants. I think before I explain what the Bank Central policy response is to balance economic growth as well as the risk of having high inflation in Indonesia. But I will put some emphasis on what Ralph actually mentioned before regarding the global economic development. On the global economic, we agree with Pak Ralph. If I can have my slide, please. Where there is a risk of having stagflation in the global economy, and at least if we monitoring slide 4, please. If we monitoring what happened in the global economy, at least there are 4 factors that we are monitoring very closely. The first factor, of course, is regarding the improved COVID-19 situation, where the number is getting lower and lower. However, we see also increasing the spreading of a new variant Omicron in several countries. And why this is also have a risk on the global economic growth is because in some countries like China, actually, they still implementing the zero COVID policy that can basically impeding China's economic growth, which we know it will translate it also in the slowing down in other emerging market economies. The second one, just like Pak Ralph mentioned, is regarding the war in Ukraine, and we all know, I think, this war actually has put pressure on commodity prices, both energy and food, which in turn also lead to high pressure on global inflation. The pressure of particularly on the food commodities also worsen because in some countries actually they start to implementing protectionism policy because the scarcity or the limited supply of global food due to the war in Ukraine. And The pandemic maybe is almost over, but the negative effect on global supply chain is still there. So this is also another factors that put pressure on inflation in many countries. The problem rise not only higher inflation, but because many central banks around the world, particularly in advanced economies such as USA, they start to response the high pressure on inflation by increasing or by implementing more aggressive monetary policy, which result first on the slowing down in economic growth almost in many countries, and also uncertainty on the global financial market. Recently, we just revised down global economic forecast from 3.5 to 2.9% this year, and with slowing down global economic growth, of course, we have to taking into account its impact on export performance in Indonesia. And however, given the unfavorable global economic development, the domestic economic recovery is still continuing in Indonesia. The latest figure of GDP, for example, posted a growth of 5.44%, which is this is much higher compared to the previous growth of 5.0% basically. And if you take a look at the source of the growth itself, mainly driven by the domestic demand, particularly household consumption, supported by the decision from the government to basically relax our policy on restricting mobility, and also because the export performance that Pak just mentioned before, the export performance is very good in Indonesia, because Indonesia is basically is still natural resources or commodity price, commodity exporting country. This is so given the higher commodity price in global, it to some extent it helps Indonesia economy to grow faster. Not to mention the impact on the fiscal or the budget that maybe Pak Adi will explain later on. However, despite this improvement on the GDP growth, still Bank Indonesia remain vigilant on the impact of a global economic slowdown on export as well as GDP growth. On the stability of the economy, we can say that basically from the sector, external sector, or in this case, balance of payment is still robust. And the financial system stability also remains solid due to strong coordination between Bank Indonesia, government, FSA, and deposit insurance institution under the KSSK, that we work together to make sure the stability of financial system remain intact. The current account in the second quarter that will be released, I think shortly, is expected to record a surplus. This is because we have a solid performance on the trades balance that during the second quarter of 2022 recorded around $15.5 billion. On the other hand, capital inflows, particularly in the form of FDI, also remain robust, so supporting our capital and financial account. In line with this development, the reserve requirement, reserve asset or international reserve asset in Indonesia is is pretty much high, if I've said so, reaching 132 billion US dollar in July, and this is sufficient enough and well above the international standard. Of course, just like any other countries, rupiah depreciated 3.9% year to date as of 29 July 2022. However, the depreciation actually is quite low compared to other countries such as Malaysia, India, and Thailand. And on the financial system, we believe that the resilience remains solid, while we also see that the banking intermediation start to increasing. The latest figure of credit in June actually is grew about 9.13%, and I'm sorry, 10.9%, and we expect it will still continue to the rest of end of June, end of 2022, and it will grow about 9 to 11% this year. So what about the inflation? Actually, this is the one thing that mentioned a couple of times by Pak Ralph. Of course, Indonesia as a small open economy, we not really isolated from what happened in the global commodity prices. It is true that inflation start to increase as we can see on the lower left chart. Inflation in July recorded 4.9%. However, if you take a look at the source of the inflation is mainly came from the supply side. This is in line with the story where commodity price start to increase, which translated into domestic inflation. On the core inflation that Bank Indonesia actually put more concern about is pretty much low. It's only 2.89% in June, and from the side of administered prices, actually the pressure is also can be eliminated by the government policy to give subsidy on certain energy and fuel prices. This is help a lot in terms of reducing the impact of global commodity price increasing to domestic inflation in Indonesia. And in 2022, however, we expect that inflation will be exceeding our target of 3 point plus minus 1%, but it will returning to the target in 2023. In the next slide, so what the given our reading or assessment on the global economic and the prospect, and also what happened in domestic economy, then Bank Indonesia implement the policy mix consists of where monetary policy is focused on maintaining stability, while other foreign instrument, which is macroprudential policy, payment system, and financial market deepening, as well as Sharia and green economy and finance will be directed toward to supporting growth. This is our effort to balance between dealing with rising inflation, and one hand. On the other hand, we also try to mitigate the impact of slowing down in global economy on the economic recovery in Indonesia. I will just highlight what we are doing on the monetary policy. First of all, we continue to strengthen our rupiah exchange rate stabilization. in line with the so-called market mechanism and also economic fundamental. Given the current turbulence in global financial market, of course, rupiah intervention is also directed to help our effort to manage inflation, particularly from the pass-through effect of rupiah depreciation. From the point of view policy rate, Bank Indonesia decided to keep Bank Indonesia 7-day reverse repo until we see a fundamental early sign of fundamental inflation rising. This is our policy on the interest rate. On the liquidity policy, we continue to implement normalization of liquidity policy, basically through reserve repo and also by increasing reserve requirement gradually. Macroprudential policy, of course, we still implementing a relaxation to support economic growth, and also the payment system digitalization and other policy. Before I close my presentation, let me inform the latest Board of Government decision on 20 and 21st July 2022, where Bank Indonesia decided to keep basically policy rate stay at 3.5%. This decision actually consistent with our projection of manageable core inflation, as I explained before, despite the risk posed by global economic moderation on the domestic economic growth. And we also strengthening our monetary policy operation, as well as strengthening rupiah stabilization policy. Above all, we also continue to strengthen our coordination with the central government and local government in maintaining inflation, because we know that inflation pressure mainly came from the supply side, which is in this case is volatile food. Then we already discussed with the central government and local government through TPID and TPID to improve the supply side of the stock of the food, and also bolster production to support food security. I think I will stop here, and I will get back to you, Pak Adi. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Wahyu. Next, I will want to give opportunity to Pak Adi from the BKF to share about the economic, also on the economic outlook, and some updates from the fiscal policy side. Given the current situation, one of the things that a lot of people are asking are related to the budget deficit target below 3%, and also what's going to be some of the things that are important to achieve that. Yeah, please, Pak Adi.
Many thanks, Pak Hadi, and the organizer of CGS-CIMB 14th Annual Indonesia Conference 2022. Really like and enjoy the presentation from Pak Wahyu and Pak Ralph Van Dong. Thanks a lot. It's bringing the very good context. And I would like to also support the statement that Indonesia is a preferred investment destination due to the economic resiliency, growth performance, and robust recovery during pandemic COVID-19. And I would like to also elaborate a little bit more on Indonesia perspective on economic development in the beginning. Let's start on my slides, slide 4. So I would like to start by highlighting some of the recent macroeconomic updates. Despite a more controllable pandemic condition and ongoing economic recovery progress in many countries, we see the escalation of various risks and challenges globally. So 3 most important are the conflicts in Ukraine, increasing commodity prices, and high global inflation. Pandora already indicated that the global growth projection were revised down. I noted that this is quite challenges for everyone. And let's also try to look at more deeply on global commodity prices. On slide 6, global commodity prices are still volatile and tend to be high. Gas prices rose again, in line with the persistent geopolitical tension, especially in Europe. Food prices is crawling up again, among others, due to the weather forecast and geopolitical sentiment after Pelosi's visit to China. However, there is a tendency to decline in prices of several energy and food commodities, such as coal, grain, wheat, in line with the weakening global outlook. If we go to slide 8, amid the uncertainty of global conditions, Indonesia's latest economic growth performance is beyond market expectation, recording a growth of 5.4, supported by high growth in household consumption and exports. High commodity prices played a part here, catalyzing strong growth in mining and agriculture sectors. It can be shown in slide 9, I think. This one has been quite pleased to inform you about this. This one. The robust recovery of Indonesia economy, supported by the National Economic Recovery or PEN program, is becoming more inclusive and bringing down unemployment and poverty rate. Unemployment rate decreases to 5.83%, while poverty rate decreases back to single digit of 9.54. On the slide 12, I would like to highlight here the triple roles of fiscal policy. First, to respond to the dynamic of the economy, and the second, to address the fundamental challenges, and the third, to support the objective of the development. As you can see, some examples inside of the boxes is actually the one that the government collaboratively with authorities would like to support the effective policy to address the global challenges, including the Indonesia currently fundamental challenges. On slide 14, during times of uncertainty and high commodity prices, the state budget acts continually as a shock absorber. It keeps inflation under control. It keeps consumption and poverty under control. It keeps the momentum of economic recovery. Of course, this role of shock absorber results in a significant increase in spending in the form of subsidies, compensation, and grants. So the government committed to maintain the healthy and sustainable budget, and how we continue to perform fiscal consolidation and reform. This is also already indicated from previous presenters. The government has various policies in place to respond to the condition of high commodity prices. These policies can be grouped into 3 objectives. First, to protect purchasing power of the people. Here, we provide incentives and subsidies to maintain affordable prices of cooking oil, gas, LPG, electricity. We also provide food, cash, and direct grant to the poor, as well as maintaining the stability of domestic prices for basic needs. The second, to maintain the ongoing economic recovery, we keep the state budget flexible to support and respond to the uncertainty. We also keep the PEN program, economic recovery, responsive and anticipatory, not only to respond the uncertainty, but also to accelerate the economic recovery. And the third, to keep our fiscal remains healthy. Under this objective, we maintain our fiscal and structural reform. All institutions have committed to spending in higher quality and more objective program. We also maintain the state budget effective as basis for strong fiscal consolidation back to 2020. 2023 commitment. On slide 16, our state budget performance, it shows here, it remains strong until the first semester of 2022. Revenue realization was up to or by 50.7% from compared to the same period last year, mainly supported by the ongoing economic recovery and global commodity prices. In the meantime, expenditure remains stable. We also recorded a surplus. On slide 18, next fiscal policy direction will be drive to increase productivity for inclusive and sustainable economic transformation through 5 focus areas, namely strengthening human capital, accelerating infrastructure development, bureaucracy reform, industrial revitalization, and green economy development. In strengthening the role of the state budget according to its basic function, which are allocation, distribution, and stabilization, we will continue our fiscal reform across 3 areas. There are revenue mobilization, spending better, and innovative and sustainable financing. On slide 20, here is the posture of the macro fiscal 2023. We aim for an economic growth of 5.4 to 5.9% and an inflation rate between 2 to 4%. We also estimate the deficit to be in the range of 2.61 to 2.85% in accordance with the fiscal consolidation as mandated in the law number 2/2020. Now, as I previously mentioned, the government continually support and promote Indonesia as a preferred investment destination. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Adi, for the comprehensive presentation. Before I come back to you later on the Green Policy Initiative, I would like to now first move to the second topic of our discussion today, which is on the green policy. Given the current climate situation globally, if that's an indication, I think it's becoming more important to pay attention to the policy initiative. I would like to start with asking Pak Ralph first to share on his view on how Indonesia can balance between the growth and also the green policy, and also what are some of the milestones and what Indonesia can actually explore to do in the next couple of years. Please, Pak Ralph. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Pak Ali, and also thank you very much, Pak Wahyu and Pak Adi for their presentations from BI and WEF. I would like to now focus, take a longer view of Indonesia's development. And here the question was how to balance future growth with a low carbon economy. And to do that, it's worth looking back, say over the last, say 30 years to see how Indonesia has been doing. And I think the charts on the left and right kind of tell the story. We can think of many other charts that tell a similar story. One is, if you look at the chart on the left, you can see that Indonesia has made important development transitions. You see, they have increased the capital stock. There's been the economy, the population urbanized. Access to electricity has increased to almost 100%. The fertility rates have fallen, and non-agricultural employment has risen strongly. So those are all indicators that all correlate well with the concept of a country that's developing and it's making important transitions for its economy and for the population. At the same time, this has been a facilitated by carbon-intensive economy. The chart on the right shows that Indonesia's carbon intensity of its economy. So we divide CO2 emissions by GDP. You can see that Indonesia, the red line, is consistently above these two blue lines, and that's what we call the interquartile range. So most countries in the world have emissions between these two lines, but Indonesia is far above that line. So even though Indonesia's carbon intensity of output is falling, which is good news, although it doesn't mean necessarily that emissions are falling, it's just that emissions relative to GDP is falling. You can see it's persistently a high carbon intensive economy. And why is that? Well, it's because Indonesia is a large country with abundant and cheap natural resources. And that's on the supply side. And Indonesia also has been underpricing those carbon intensive resources for use in its development model, and that's the demand side. So let's go a bit deeper. For example, Indonesia has an abundant supply of land, which come from carbon-rich forests and peatlands. And once you drain peatlands and you cut forests, you release carbon. And it has an abundant supply of energy resources, particularly coal, but also oil and gas. And those have driven Indonesia's emissions profile, land-based emissions and energy-based emissions. Now, on the demand side, large part of the economy has been using these resources to drive development for electricity generation, for industrial development, transportation, urban expansion, agriculture, and forestry. And these trends have then been further reinforced by the underpricing of carbon in land energy resources. And by underpricing, we mean for years there was no carbon tax, there was no explicit taxation of emissions. There are still energy subsidies, although less than before, they're still there. And there are all sorts of policies in place that ultimately make these resources, these carbon-intensive resources, cheap, and therefore leading to a high carbon-intensive economy. Now, Indonesia has been making plans. They've committed, of course, in the Paris Agreement, but also they've recently released a report called the Indonesia Long-Term Strategy for Low Carbon and Climate Resilience by 2050. And this is a set of scenarios that are consistent with the Paris Agreement until 2030. But the question is what to do after the Paris commitments. And you see they have three scenarios. One is the kind of business as usual continued. And you can see that although as of today, land-based emissions are very high, in the future, most emissions will come from energy, mainly coal. And you can see that there is a second scenario called transition, where emissions will taper off. And you can see that to the extent that Indonesia is able to protect its peatlands, protect its mangroves and restore them, and switch to less intensive forms or extensive forms of agriculture, the land use sector may become a net sink for emissions. They may absorb emissions. And in fact, the LCCP scenario, low carbon scenario compatible with the Paris Agreement target, that's the one that ultimately seems to be going towards net zero. Not in 2050, but 2060 or so. How can you achieve that? Well, the two main sources of emissions have to be addressed. On the one hand, the forestry and land use sector, FOLU, has to become a net sink, so it will absorb carbon. And Indonesia has the right policy framework in place to achieve that. But the big debate is about how to make sure the energy sector becomes much less emitting. And that means you need a massive energy transition to take place over the next few decades. And that's where the real challenge is and where the consensus has to become stronger and stronger within the government and the private sector. So let's take a look more detailed at the energy emissions pathway. In the December 2021 Indonesia Economic Prospects, we included a report on how to go about the energy transition. And here we've modeled 3 different pathways. Pathway 1 is the current long-term energy generation plan called RUPTL in Indonesian. The second one is a coal phase-out over 20 years. And the third one is decarbonization. You can see that compared to 2021, all 3 scenarios are going to lead to less coal electricity generation. It's kind of stable in the RUPTL, but it becomes very small and even zero if this scenario of total decarbonization is followed. And of course, something else that has to take over. For example, maybe gas and carbon storage will be a kind of intermediate pathway to get there. Now, what does that mean for emissions? Well, you can see that the RUPTL, so the current government policy, is going to lead to a peak of emissions in energy by the mid-2030s, and then it will fall. Now, a more ambitious pathway, which is the coal phase-out, will lead to emissions peaking already in 2025 and then fall and stabilize in the 2030s and 40s. And the most ambitious coal decarbonization pathway is going to lead to immediately emissions will start to fall already in the mid-2020s and will go all the way down to this level by 2040. Now, these pathways are all feasible, but they need a lot of preconditions, a lot of willingness of the public policy to decommission coal power plants, to make space for renewable energy, to make sure firms can, that the electricity networks can handle variable renewable energy in its networks, etc. Now, these pathways will also have different consequences for the price of energy. And you can see generally the price will fall, but the most ambitious pathway, given that there will be a lot of decommissioning of coal plants, use of more expensive gas than coal, more investment, there will be a price peak if you go for the total decarbonization pathway. But ultimately, we think this is manageable as long as you can protect poor households. So this shows you a bit where we see the trade-offs of the energy transition. On the one hand, we expect to see job losses in coal, but there will be gains in job creation and renewable energy. And that means that if you want to go about an energy transition, you have to make sure that the transition is going to be fair. We call it a just transition, meaning the government really has to make sure that people working in coal and coal-related sectors will be given the opportunity, retraining and education to transition to different forms of employment. As we said earlier, more ambition will lead temporarily to higher prices, but these are manageable as long as you can protect poor households. And ultimately, renewable energy is going to be cheaper even than coal. And then finally, there are local and global co-benefits of the transition that we have not taken into account. For example, emissions of small particles will be much less. That means that health and premature deaths, health will improve and premature deaths will be reduced. So there are all sorts of other benefits besides global co-benefits that Indonesia will be important in Indonesia that we have not taken into account here. So the energy transition is possible, but you need to have the right policy frameworks in place. So this leads to a set of priorities for these main sectors of emissions. On the forestry side, we recommend continued strengthening the policy framework to support net zero emissions from the forestry land use, and have a financing plan to get there. It's important to develop plans to incentivize districts to have better spatial planning, expand farm outreach and financing to improve agricultural yields, especially those of smallholders, so that Indonesia can move from a what's called extensive form of agriculture, meaning to grow more, you need to cut more forests, you go to a more intensive form of agriculture where you improve the yields of your existing fields. And that will not only help reduce emissions, but also will improve incomes in the farming sector. So that cuts both ways. Then for the structural transformation on the energy transition, it's important to have a strategy found on 5 pillars. It's important to have a comprehensive decarbonization approach for coal. It's important to accelerate pricing and subsidy reforms. And we've talked about it before many times by now. We understand that the poor has to be shielded against high energy prices, but there are multiple ways to doing it. And blanket subsidies are the worst way to do it. And targeted social protection is the best way to go about it, both from the poor household side, but also from the fiscal side. It's important to improve the investment climate for renewable energy, and the new energy bill may be an important step towards making investment in renewable energy more commercially viable. It's important to strengthen the capacity of electricity networks, because renewable energy like solar and wind will be intermittent. It will fluctuate. So you have to deal with variable renewable energy mixed into your electricity network. And finally, manage the poverty and social impacts of the energy transition. We talked earlier about the just transition of those working in the coal sector and related sectors. But also it's important to shield the poor from higher energy costs. And finally, it's important that fiscal policy incentivizes transition. So reduce the fuel subsidies, replace the electricity subsidy with targeted cash transfers, develop the trajectory for carbon pricing to put a positive price on carbon emissions and reinvest the proceeds. At the moment, the carbon tax has been put in the law, but implementation, we hope, is going to happen over the next few months, and we'd like to hear more from the government. But even if once the carbon tax has been implemented, at $2 per ton, it's still on the low side. Across all the about 60 countries in the world that have put in place a carbon tax. So it's important that once the tax is in place, to have a roadmap to make the price on carbon positive, and make sure that the tax starts to bite. And then if you reinvest the carbon tax well, you can shield the poor, but also facilitate the energy transition and make sure that the money invested will become a new source of growth. And finally, also look at the biofuel subsidies. I will stop here. All the work we've talked about can be found online in our global economic prospects about the stagflation risk, but also our Indonesia economic prospects, both the one on June, but also if you're interested in the energy transition, please look at the December 2021 Indonesia economic prospects. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ralph. That's a very insightful presentation. Maybe if we have time Q&A for follow-up, but before that, I would like to give opportunity to Pak Wahyu. Traditionally, BI role may not be viewed as the main policymaker for green policy initiative, but I think this will be interesting opportunity for us to probably understand more about what role BI can play on this side. Please, Pak Wahyu.
Thank you, Pak Adi. Well, I think before explaining Bank Indonesia response in supporting global effort to accelerate green economic and finance, maybe it's better for me to share our view on why climate change matters for the central bank, including Bank Indonesia, in maintaining economic stability as well as supporting economic growth. I think as we can see on the slide 11, I believe. Is it 11? Well, I think we all know that climate change actually is real. It's real and is here. And unfortunately, it's only will be getting worse if we are not taking strong measures immediately and consistently to reduce the unfortunate global global weather. As we can see on the upper left chart, the the global temperature is increasing, and it leads to more frequent and worse or extreme natural disaster, including in Indonesia. And the problem then is this natural disaster actually causing a production problem, particularly in agriculture area, which we can see from the, I think, the last couple months figure of inflation. Actually, the source of the inflation, one of them is because the bad weather in the production center area of certain food commodities, including chili and onion in eastern part of Indonesia. This is the true example why the Bank Indonesia or the central bank really care about global climate change. And I think we all know that technically the effect of global climate change can be divided into physical risk and transitional risk, where the physical risk is just like as I said before, affecting the production side, and both of them will create or pose threat on the monetary policy, monetary stability, as well as the financial system stability. Well, knowing this risk, actually, many central banks around the world, including Indonesia, particularly because Indonesia is a natural resource-rich country, we aware that if we let the climate change continue, then Indonesia will be one of country that suffer most from this global climate change. For this reason, actually, Indonesia, as Ralph mentioned before, has participated on the global effort to reduce carbon emission by ratifying Paris Agreement. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, we agreed to cut carbon emission by about 41% at the end of 2030. Of course, Bank Indonesia is supporting this effort, and we emphasize that the transition process toward a low carbon economy should be done smoothly, because this transition process will be long and it's not going to be easy. One of them is regarding to how we finance this transition process or period toward the low carbon economy. Well, I'll put it on the rough terminology. The transition should be just and, of course, affordable way, because I think Bappenas has been estimate how much financing we need to move toward a low carbon economy, and the number is not really low, and that's why the central bank in this regard can participate in providing but not directly financing to the effort lowering carbon emission, but through several policies that I will explain later on. On the next slide, I think this is our roadmap to achieve low carbon banking industry, as I mentioned before, which is in our perspective, banking industry will play a critical role in supporting green financing in this case. And the journey starting in 2010, where we initiating effort to or participated more on the effort to reduce the emission, and right now actually we are on the stage of developing, where the policy can be categorized into three pillars of strategy. The first one is strengthening green macroprudential policy, and Second was deepening green money market, and the third pillar of strategy is developing green economic and inclusive MSME. I will talk shortly what we are doing right now in detail on the next slide, please. Well, our policy, our strategy in strengthening green macroprudential policy, basically is we trying to integrating the green initiative into our existing policy to support climate transition. We are on the view that in order to reduce carbon emission, the bank must increase the portion of green financing, so it can become a catalyst for the transformation, not only the bank itself, but also the debtors to be more greener. Therefore, with this framework, our green macroprudential policy is designed to give incentives, not penalty, but more give incentives to the bank to extend lending in the green related sector. So we kind of differentiated incentive between lending in green sector and in the brown sector, which we put more incentives to lending on the green sector. For example, I think a couple of years ago, we already implemented the so-called green loan to value ratio policy, LTV, which is basically if you want to buy green housing, then basically if bank agree, bank can not asking you to provide a down payment. It's different from policy that apply if, let's say, we buy the standard housing. So by doing so, we hope that not only the bank will eager to give more finance on the green housing, but it also give incentive for the customer as on the demand side, as a customer to buy more on the green housing. This is one example that we are doing back in, I guess, a couple of years ago, and this policy is not implemented only by the Bank Indonesia because you know, a banking system is quite complicated sectors that we have coordinated with the OJK, where OJK itself give also incentive by treating a special treatment for the green loan asset quality in their book, basically. Currently, we are working to develop other green macroprudential tools that already in our pipeline, including green inclusive financing ratio, green liquidity buffer, as well as a green intermediation ratio. This all is basically we try to give more incentive for the bank to lend more, basically on the green sector economy. The second pillar actually is green money market deepening. Why the Bank Indonesia focus on the green money market deepening? As I mentioned earlier, one of problem on the transition period toward the low carbon economy is about the financing, how we finance this transition. And in this strategy, we develop basically three framework. The first one is we are right now is researching and developing a framework for green commercial paper, green repo, and green derivative to support the continuation of sustainable business practices. That's the first strategy on deepening green money market. The second one is Bank Indonesia also actually increasing our portfolio allocation of foreign exchange reserve on sustainable and responsible investment. Right now, we also basically allocate some portion of our reserve in terms of a green bond. This is to show to the world that Bank Indonesia has a strong commitment to support the green economy, green finance as our main policy. The last, I think, the last effort on monetary policy, of course, is on the how Bank Indonesia actually implemented the monetary policy operation. Is still under discussion and intense discussion internally in Bank Indonesia. We are still looking for the possibility to expand eligible collateral in our monetary policy to include green bond, Sharia bonds, and other green financial instruments. This is different from our current way in conducting monetary operation that only accepting standard government bonds and other high quality asset as a collateral when the bank are dealing with the Bank Indonesia, particularly on the market, and hopefully we can get this new framework established soon. So it can help to finance the green financing initiative. The last strategy, of course, is developing green and inclusive economic in finance, where Bank Indonesia basically providing assistance to help MSMEs to transform into green MSMEs. So basically, we using incentive approach, we try to transform the brown MSME to green MSME in three ways. Basically, by reducing the waste or implementing zero waste, and second one is environmental friendly practices for the MSME, and of course the last one is providing incentive for the bank to give a green lending for SMME. I think that's all for my presentation on the green initiative. Thank you, Pak Hadi.
Thank you, Pak Wahyu, for sharing some of probably concepts that are probably new to us that we are not aware. Hope to see. Will be interesting to see the deeper implementation going forward. Next, I would like to give opportunity to Pak Adi to share from the fiscal policymaker perspective on some of the green policy initiative. I think there have been a number of developments in the last couple of years from BKF side that investor will be interested to hear. Thank you. Please, Pak Adi.
Thank you, Pak Hadi. Following up on the green policy or green economy development, I think we can explore together that green economy development is one of the focus area of Indonesia fiscal policy. I would like to touch upon a bit on the fiscal policies to support clean and sustainable energy transition. As you may already aware, the government of Indonesia has committed to contributing to adapting global climate change and achieving the Paris Agreement to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Indonesia commitments are stated in National Determined Contribution by 2030, as indicated in this slide. The activities comprising not limited to mitigation and adaptation for supporting the climate resilience, and as already indicated by previous speakers, the long-term strategy for low carbon and climate resilience is already established and committed towards the net zero emission by 2060 or sooner. Of course, such commitment has significant financial consequences. To the cumulative mitigation costs until 2030 are estimated to reach between 247.3 billion to 263.39 billion US dollar. As such policy are needed to ensure that this funding are met not only from internal capacity, from government, but also from others, such as private multi-donors and multilateral cooperation. In specific to support this policy, I would like to highlight the existing or the current mechanism. The first one is the energy transition mechanism. This is the policy in financing support, which involves participation both public and private sectors. For IUPTL, for example, orders to accelerate the growth of renewable energy in electricity sector by shortening the operation period of fossil power plants. And nonetheless, these are few constraints that currently exposed by this mechanism, financing mechanism, such as efficiency, just energy transition, and also its affordability. The solution here is to utilize a coordinated mechanism to generate synergies, collaboration in combining the necessary de-risking facilities with the required financing. It can be portrayed in the next slide, I believe. Yes, this one. If we would like to see here, the mechanism of ATM has been launched, and the government committed to support this as part of the emphasizing the importance of collaboration between national, multilateral, as well as all strategic partners. I will not go into the detail about the mechanism, but I would like to mention a few things about Indonesia ETM country platform. Yeah, the Indonesia ETM country platform has just been launched during the G20 FMCBG meeting in Bali last July. Here, the PT SMI, Sarana Multi-Infrastructure, or PT SMI, has been appointed as the ETM country platform manager. And it will be coordinating with stakeholders, preparing comprehensive studies on fiscal support, and taking the necessary early steps to implement this country platform. The ETM country platform is a major step that enables Indonesia energy infrastructure improvement and total clean energy transition towards net zero emission through affordable means. The second mechanism is the carbon tax. Carbon tax is an instrument of carbon pricing. It is a part of the comprehensive policy package for climate change mitigation, and this has been already enacted by previous reform in the HPP law, or the tax law last year. Yeah. These are three objectives of carbon tax, which are to change the behavior, to support emission reduction, and drive innovation and investment. The principles of carbon tax are just, affordable, and gradually implemented. To support a just and sustainable energy transition, we have designed a carbon tax roadmap up to 2025. Unfortunately, due to the global economic uncertainties, the implementation of carbon tax has been postponed. Yet, nevertheless, the government is continuing with the formulation of necessary regulations to implement the carbon tax in the future. We may continually monitor the global domestic economic condition to see the right moment for the implementation of the carbon tax later this year. I think this is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pak Adi, for sharing some of the key updates regarding the important initiative. I think we still have time for one or two questions on the floor. And I would like to open the Q&A session. If anyone from the Zoom would like to ask questions, you can either use the chat. I believe there's a raise hand function feature as well if you want to ask directly. Yeah, maybe as we wait for a question from the floor, if you don't mind, I will start from question from my side first. My question is for Pak Adi. You mentioned regarding some of the global developments. I know it has been a very extraordinary situation in the last 2 years or so. How has this actually affected? I mean, you already mentioned some things. If we can go a bit deeper and about what has been affected on the green policy initiative from the BKF side, and also what more detail about what policymakers are actually looking closely at before probably embarking again on the initiative like the carbon tax, as you mentioned.
Thank you, Adi. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think the work has been put on the effective and efficient financing support for climate change has been enormous. So Indonesia currently at the stake of if we're trying to compare with the global practices, we try to match with the global practices, and we are quite in line with the multilateral approach on moving towards net zero. The Minister of Finance is also one of the co-chairs for the climate change mitigation action. And this is quite apparent when Indonesia also leading in the G20 chairmanship, particularly on the sustainable finance working group. Not to mention currently, Pak Adi, the capacity or the contribution not only from the budget and from the key partners, multilateral, as well as the strategic partners from private and international, has been quite nurtured. And the one of key examples here is actually improving the capacity and the literacy, the awareness about the significant challenges and costs for the disasters created by climate change. And this, I do believe this will become the future global challenges for everyone. That's why, as it already been indicated by Pak Wahyu, I believe that we must also be careful about the transition, because it should be affordable, it should be just, and we know exactly that it involves also the business that Indonesia currently would like to transform, together. So the commitment has been reached up towards now is we committed to net zero by 2060 or sooner, meaning that all efforts will contribute to that commitment, Pak Adi. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Adi. That's very clear. Appreciate the additional explanation. I think we have one last question from Mr. Xianchu from BNP. The question is, one of the panel speakers have mentioned about making subsidies more targeted. Are there any example of such approach and the subsequent success of said move? I think this may be related to things that Pak Ralph or Pak Adi had mentioned, but maybe if you don't mind, I would like to ask for Pak Ralph on this question regarding on the targeted subsidies and example of such approach and the success of such move. Yeah, please, Pak Ralph. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Actually, one of the best examples of subsidy reforms is Indonesia itself. Indonesia has tried for 2 decades, embarked on many many cases of subsidy reforms. Some of them were sustainable, others were not. Others led to protests, as those in Indonesia may know better than I do. But those that were most sustainable were the ones where the government, and especially the Minister of Finance and maybe the Ministry of Social Affairs, was really able to clearly communicate to all the stakeholders what the benefits would be from the reform. And they've done that successfully in 2005, when the first major round of subsidy reforms led to fiscal savings, which were then invested in direct cash transfers and the strengthening of primary education. And that has led to a lot of acceptance of those reforms, since the benefits were very clear to the stakeholders. Similarly, in 2014, to 2016, when the first Jokowi administration came into power, they again embarked on a subsidy reform where the proceeds were invested in health, in infrastructure to finance the infrastructure boom, but also in, again, social protection. This time to strengthen a conditional cash transfer program. These reforms, what we see typically in Indonesia is that they work for a few years, and then there will always be regression. And we've seen that again with the fuel subsidy reforms of 2015. After a few years, the reform was left in place, but the prices were fixed, and that effectively leads to a partial reintroduction of the reforms, but not through the budget, but then through the state-owned enterprises that provide the fuels to the market. Now, so that means that is a step back. Now, what's good to know is if you take a longer view and you look really over the last 20 years, is that the net impact of the reforms has been positive over 20 years. Meaning that although there have always been steps back, the steps forward have been more. And if you look at the budget, the subsidy bill was over 3-4% of GDP in the early 2000s, and now it's about 1% of GDP in the budget today. And of course, if you count in the fact that the fuel and electricity state-owned enterprises implicitly provide the subsidy, even if you add those numbers in, you still see that the total subsidy bill is less than it used to be if you look back 1 or 2 decades with the same level of global commodity prices as today. So the net effect is positive, and it's important for Indonesia to continue to fight at the right moment and continue to do it. But yeah, other countries have also successfully reduced subsidies. There's Kenya, there's Philippines, and there are many other countries which we're studying to see how they're doing it. But we consider what Indonesia has done in 2 big rounds, meaning reform subsidies and use the proceeds for better investment and communicate it well to the public. That's considered very good practice, and we hope that Indonesia will find that opportunity again to do it for the next round. Thanks.
Thank you, Pak Ralph. I think that's a good explanation to end on a positive note. Although we would like to continue the discussion, we'll have to wrap up for this session. We'll have another session on consumer consciousness at 11. If any of the participants want to join. But before wrapping up, I would like to say big thanks for Pak Ralph and also Pak Wahyu and Pak Adi for being very insightful for the insightful sharing that we have today. Looking forward to probably have you again to share more of your insight in the future. But thank you, and thank you also for all the investors who has participated in this session. I would like to say hope all of us can have good health during this pandemic, and so also have nice for the rest of the day. Thank you, everyone. We'll wrap it up here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Adi. Thank you, Pak Ralph.
Thank you.
Pak Adi.
Everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.